Goliath Online. Hey everybody, welcome to the self-titled D&D-ish channel. How's it going? I know it's been a while. I have an excuse, and that is I got a new job, and since this thing was, second to the step back videos, I decided that I was gonna hold off. So I hope to remedy it by making some more stuff in the future, but for the moment, please be a little bit forgiving as I figure out how to make my life work now that I am working 2.5 jobs. So today, we're going to take a viewer requested topic and we're going to talk about Goliaths, the tall, hairless, gray-skinned, tattooed mountain people that have been common. Well, they've never really been common, but they've been existing in D&D ever since the 3rd edition. So of course, we need to start with, what is a Goliath? What does Goliath mean? And the first mention of such a name actually comes from the Bible. I'm sure that many of you have heard about David and Goliath, and so we'll talk a little bit about what the story is and what it means, and we'll quickly transition. So Goliath was a character from the book of Samuel and was a giant Philistine warrior. Very often in the Jewish tradition, Goliath represents the powers of paganism, having lots of strength, but still being secondary to the power of Yahweh. While Christians would probably say that the story of David and Goliath represents the power of God overcoming God's enemies. Sort of a proto-Jesus story. And if you read the Bible, you'll actually find that there are a lot of proto-Jesus stories. However, in the story, Goliath is the bad guy. So in the story, the Israelites are facing against the Philistines in a constant conflict. And now in this story, just as there was in a lot of conflicts in the past, sometimes they do representative battles rather than literal battles, which meant that they would have two people fight one-on-one to see which one had more power from their respective deities and decide the fate of the battle based on that, so there's not as much bloodshed needed. Goliath, being a massive and powerful warrior, manages to defeat pretty much all oncomers for about 40 days, taking on 2 challengers every single day. That is until enter David. David is a small, weak, not exactly huge, not exactly buff Israelite who decides to take up an offer of reward for a challenge against the Goliath. The king Saul offers him his armor. He declines. And then when the battle actually happens, David comes in smaller, weaker, completely looking like he's going to lose. But he famously uses a sling, which is a regular weapon from that period, and catches Goliath right between the eyes, knocking him down. And when he's down, David decapitates him. So the mythological construct of the Goliath is a pretty standard one. It's known for his ferocity, his strength, and his size, which is what I believe the Dungeons & Dragons people were trying to draw upon when they made the Goliaths a playable race in Dungeons & Dragons. According to biblical accounts and different types of analysis, he could be between the height of 6'9" to 9'9". So take that as you will. Very tall. And that actually feels very close to about the height of your regular Goliaths. I think Goliaths typically are about 7 feet tall. And also we have to talk about what the Goliaths are also drawing upon, which is that there's always been legends about giants, large mountain men, and large powerful people who live on the fringes of society. There's always rumors that in the wilds there are large and powerful men, and I think the Goliath plays into a lot of these stereotypes. There's even a concept that comes up that people who don't live in civilized society, who live off the land, who have a harsh and harder existence, become stronger physically, and so you end up with the Goliath. Judging how D&D, when they talk about barbarians and they talk about Goliaths, they make an emphasis on how harsh the climate that they live in is and how much the struggle to survive is what makes them so strong. I think this is what they're trying to play off. So let's talk about its appearance in Dungeons & Dragons. The first mention of a Goliath was in version 3.5 in a 2004 book called Races of Stone. They showed up as a playable race in the 4th edition Player's Handbook 2, and they showed up as a playable race in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition with Volo's Guide to Monsters. Actually, it started as the player's companion to the Elemental Evil hardcover adventure, but it was released also in the rule supplement section of Follows Guide to Monsters. They're described in a very peculiar way. They have gray skin, they have featureless white eyes, and tribal tattoos covering their body. And of course, no hair, unless you're Grog. Their society is described as harsh and unforgiving as the climate they live in. They are known to have a society that's focused on strength and survival of the fittest, and not having any sort of sympathy for the weak or those who are unable to take care of themselves. On top of that, though, they have a strong emphasis on fair play and competition. They believe that life is a competition, and that if you're going to have a fair competition to figure out who is going to control what, that is the proper way to organize society. So with this whole idea of harsh climate, harsher culture, survival of the fittest, competition, you start to realize that this is a lot of how the player's handbook describes the barbarian class. And I think that that's an important thing to point out, that the Goliath was almost pigeonholed into becoming a barbarian. They are a barbarian's barbarian. Everything that plays into the mythology of the barbarian, it can be backed up by playing a Goliath. So I am no surprise that the Goliath Barbarian is probably the most common class to play with it. And it's not just because of Grog. So let's talk about how they show up in other settings. I looked it up, and it turns out that Goliaths got shoehorned into a lot of settings because they came out later than a lot of settings' original books. But they don't change a whole lot. For example, in Dark Sun, they're called half-giants. The main thing that they point out is that they were made through some sort of magic spell, and that they are a race that have been basically enslaved. When they were created for the sole purpose of being like soldiers and gladiators. And that's what Goliaths stay as to this day. Eberron, the setting tells a fairly common story as well. They don't really talk about Goliaths all that much. Although when they are mentioned, they're mentioned for being small in number, and importantly, so it kind of fits into the entire mythology that we're setting up here, that they weaken when kept in captivity. And really that what gives them their vitality is their wildness and their living on the edge of civilization. In Ravenloft, they're actually considered legendary creatures and have never been seen in a long time. And actually, what I find really amusing is they're actually in Spelljammer, this sort of science fantasy D&D in space story. They live in asteroids. So like they grow and they live in the harsh climates that are on asteroids, and they are friends with dwarves. I think it's interesting to know that Goliaths live on little space rocks. And then we talk about Exandria, the campaign setting that Critical Role takes place in, and I don't think anyone has done more PR for the Goliaths than Travis Willingham with his portrayal of Grog Strongjaw. We'll talk about him in a second. According to the campaign setting, they are relatives of stone giants. This comes up fairly often, that they have a relation with stone giants. I don't think that Tal'Dorei is unique in that. I think that the Taldorian Goliaths and most Goliaths have some sort of giant connection. I believe when you choose to play a Goliath, giant is one of the languages that you get when you first start. And they're not exactly into diplomacy. The quote that comes from the Tal'Dorei campaign setting says that only people of little strength like to talk. Also, they move around in family groups that are called herds. So I think that we should talk about the different characters that have shown up in the Tal'Dorei campaign. We have Grog Strongjaw, who was one of the Vox Machina campaign members. He was, of course, a bit of a comic relief. He was the dim-witted barbarian who really pulled through in the violence when it was needed. He was kind of indestructible, but the whole thing about his character arc over time was to learn that violence sometimes is not enough, and that relying on your friends and such is sort of the thing that you should do in order to be truly strong. Grog himself was, of course, exiled from his Goliath herd, and Grog grew up with the cleric, the gnome cleric Pike, and her uncle. And so he really kind of lived outside of Goliath society for a while. And reconciling those two, I think, was part of the Grog story. Although I should say, for the most part, he was comic relief. his biological uncle was named Kevdak, and he was the leader of the Goliath herd. And they did come around later in the campaign during the dragon story, the whole Vestiges of Divergence and Thordak storyline, to find the town that Grog and Pike grew up in and having it being conquered by Goliaths led by Kevdak. And Kevdak, who had not only allied himself with a black dragon, but also had somehow gotten the Vestige of Divergence, the Knuckles of the Stone Giant. And the big storyline of this was about Grog finally facing off against Kevdak, defeating him in combat, and that was when Grog got his Stone Giant Knuckles that were a big part of his arsenal later. I think the other one that we should mention, there are a few Goliaths that are mentioned as like secondary characters that don't really get a lot of speaking lines, but one other one we should mention is Shale, which was a female one-armed Goliath fighter who appeared in an episode, I think maybe 2 episodes of Critical Role, just one, and was played by Chris Perkins, the actual D&D employee, Chris Perkins. And he played Shale for the battle against, the Black Dragon of the whole Chromatic Conclave storyline that is completely escaping me at this moment. But she was, just like many Goliaths, harsh and brutal, and even with one arm, she could whoop the crap out of somebody. She was pretty cool. And of course, before we go, we'll talk about my setting. And I actually haven't had a player yet play a Goliath. So I haven't really thought too much about what Goliaths are going to be and what they're going to represent in my setting. But what I will say is that I have this vague idea of a vast northern region that has steppe plateaus and prairies, but also is bordered by a large mountain range. And I do think that if Goliaths are going to be prominent anywhere, it's going to be there. Goliaths would probably have some sort of rural mountain society, and in a place that is very much filled with things like tribes of orcs and centaurs and all sorts of interesting creatures that don't really have any sort of settled society, I think that they'll fit in just fine. Now, if you're going to play a Goliath in one of your games, if you're going to be a Goliath player, keep in mind that your story is probably going to be a fish out of water. Unless something very strange is in your backstory, a Goliath is going to have spent the first years of their lives probably living in a herd, a small family group that doesn't have much in the way of culture, communication, or really any sort of settled civilization. And so this is somebody who has lived a culture of competition, violence, and just the harsh struggle to survive. Now, as an adventurer, you're probably going to find yourself in a lot of civilized situations and dealing with all sorts of different people and realizing that there are different forms of strength. I think that story of realization and that clash as the Outlander will probably be a central part of any Goliath storyline. And if you're a dungeon master who's going to run Goliaths in your story, I would say to play against the stereotype of the mountain tribes and the barbarians. Keep in mind that while they do value strength above all, it is in the context of a harsh climate. They may perceive weakness as a bad thing, but it comes from a place of the struggle to survive. And I think that framing it more as like, we can't afford to help the weak, we can't afford to not live life like competition, will lead to a more sympathetic type of race and more interesting stories. And keep in mind that many of these quote-unquote barbarian tribes like the Goliaths could very much still participate in a greater society. Very often, rural people who are nomadic in our past, made living by protecting trade or by raiding trade routes. And so you'd very much find that they would live always on the fringes of society rather than completely on their own, because they could get the finished goods and they could make their living by participating in this kind of dangerous environment. And it does mean that they will have things like finished goods and awesome items It's just that they will be much rarer, and the ones that they have will probably have been repaired and re-repaired and re-repaired. And things that are finished, things that are manufactured, will probably have a high value attached to them. So definitely play that up. But yeah, that's all I have for now, but that's the Goliath. They're an interesting race. I think that they've been a little underdeveloped in the source material because I don't know why. So if you have a Goliath you want to play, definitely try to flesh out their story a little bit. I'm sure there's a lot of things you can do with it. Anyways, I have one last thing I want to talk about before you guys go. I have finally gotten myself into a weekly D&D game that I am running. It's been a long time coming, especially after I got the new job. There's been like a month where I wasn't able to play any D&D, and I really didn't know what my life schedule would look like. And so I put together this small, simple group that we can mess around with, and I'm very, very happy to have it. And I want to know if you guys, to get a little bit more stuff going up on this channel, would you be interested in me recounting the adventures and talking about what's going on and how I approach as a DM as a sort of campaign diary? Does that sound like something you'd be interested in? If so, let me know down in the comments. Otherwise, like, share, subscribe, etc. And I'll see you guys next time, and hopefully that'll be a lot sooner than this time, and I apologize for that.